Hello dear viewers, and welcome back to the ancient dwarven hold of our ancestors. Today I shall be talking about the game V Rising. V Rising is an action role-playing base building survival game developed and published by Stunlock Studios. It was released in May of 2024. Before we get started, dear viewer, if you like what I do down here in the ancient hold, then perhaps consider subscribing to the channel if you've yet to do so. Also, consider giving us a thumbs up and perhaps leave your comments with your own thoughts on the game or what I've been talking about. So, V Rising. This is a game that I've been aware of for quite some time. It was in early access for a while and received a fair amount of interest even then, and now, a year after its release proper, I'm going to take a look at it. V Rising is all about being a vampire, moving about the place using your special abilities to deceive and devour your enemies, and create a mighty castle from which to lord it over the denizens of the land. Vampires, of the Dracula type and others, have featured in many video games over the decades, from the Castlevania series to Legacy of Kain, Vampire the Masquerade, Vampire, Van Helsing and all sorts, being both the pro and antagonist of the title. There is a rich history of the vampiric sort in the video game. For being a vampire is well suited to either role. They obviously thrive as the antagonist of a game, with their dark and sinister ways oozing evilry. They have armies of undead and thralls to do their bidding, while they conspire to darken malevolent ends from the shadows of the world. This provides a mighty backdrop for a brave hero to fight their way through, and when they reach the end and the final encounter, they will be met by a creature with vast powers that will truly test their abilities to combat the forces of evil. As a protagonist, they can appear as an anti-hero, one who tries to control their primordial urges for the flesh of humans and the draw of their delicious blood. They are likely shunned by the outer world for their dark ways and insidious form. Their array of powers suits well the sense of player progression as they acquire more vampiric powers and abilities. The thirst for blood can also be an interesting mechanic to have to deal with as you play. V Rising is pitched as a survival base-building action role-playing game where you can play with others online or on your own solo. This video will talk exclusively about how the game plays from a single player perspective, rather than an online and/or with other people. If you're looking for something talking about the online features of V Rising, then besides the general gameplay, this won't be able to inform you about those things. If you are interested in how this game plays as a straight up single player game by some silly old dwarf, then this is the one for you. When you first fire up V Rising, you're able to select a game from the game menu. There are different difficulty settings you can go for, from a more relaxed story mode play, where combat is easy and not too challenging, to normal, which has challenging combat, and hard setting, where I imagine you get pummeled mercilessly. I'm too old to be playing stuff on the hardest difficulty, so I went with the straight down the middle normal mode. There are other settings too, to which you can cater your game to, but I left mine to the default, of which I will talk about later. Once the game loads, and it can take a little while, dear viewer, even with a fancy solid-state drive to load from, you will initially be met with an in-game cinematic, where the vampires are shown to have once ruled the land and its people, but were overthrown by the humans and cast down. Now, many years later, you awaken a vampire, a slayer in the night. You must head forth and remake your dominion over the land and rule once more. The perspective for V Rising is an isometric kind of view, with your character at the centre of the screen, and you able to zoom out quite far back. You can also move the camera around a full 360 degrees. The graphical style is somewhat stylised, but mostly a fairly relaxed portrayal of a gothic fantasy world containing humans, steampunk and real-life animals, but also the strange beasts, magic and of course vampires. You would be right to state the graphics here are not apex, bleeding edge and all that, but I think they are decent and do very well for the theme of the game. It all looks good to this old dwarf. I've said it before, but I do think it's true, that we have reached a certain quality in graphics that I am particularly happy with. Yes, things can look all fancy with hair physics and all that, but to me, as long as they look decent enough, then I'm not particularly bothered. Gameplay is king. The main character, your vampire, is able to be customised somewhat, but you can't go mad with it, with them looking mostly the same with a few slight differences. You're going to be wearing armour that covers everything up anyway, and usually you're going to be quite zoomed out, so it doesn't matter that much in the scheme of things. Sound-wise, there's a lot going on here. The orchestral soundtrack feels well suited to the themes of the game, providing an ominous and dark background. The sounds of movement to combat and spell use sound good, and importantly, give right feeling audio feedback to your actions. There isn't a lot in terms of NPC communication. There isn't reams of text to read, and therefore there wouldn't be a lot to do a voiceover for. What there is though is the bosses which you will be tracking as part of your gameplay. When you engage them, and as the fight progresses, they will shout out to you, fully voiced in game. General NPCs can shout out in panic and such when you come near as well. There isn't a lot of talk going on generally, as that isn't one of the focuses of this game. When you start off, you'll be armed with very little, and will not have much in terms of equipment. You'll be given some quick tutorials on how to move your character and have them swing a sword, as well as explaining certain features of the game, like feeding and interactions with sunlight, for sunlight, dear viewer, is anathema to a vampire. Importantly, you will also be introduced to castle building. In V-Rising, your castle or base is very important, not only as a symbol of your power, but also because as the focal point of your main interactions when doing stuff in the game. This is where all your crafting is performed, where your coffin resides, where you have a fancy garden, your stock of materials, and all sorts. The heart of your castle is literally the castle heart, which is the first thing that must be created when building a new castle. It must also have a steady feed of blood, otherwise your keep will decay. Once you have placed your heart, you'll be able to build further parts of your castle. Your heart creates a zone of control, in which you can place items. The areas where you can build castles are divided into square grids, which allows you to place flooring and walls rather easily. Walls are useful if you want to create new floors for your castle. Your base will house all of your different crafting stations. You will unlock these as you progress through the game, which you will have going constantly. Storage items are also housed here, where you can leave your crafting materials and other items, and they will stay safe, in single player anyway. I think possibly these storage items and possibly other stuff could well be destroyed with online play, but in single player mode, of which this video is talking about, that isn't a worry. The world of V-Rising is a very large map indeed, consisting of a central area known as Dunley Farmlands, which is exactly what you might think it might be, with farms all over the shop, along with militia camps and other bits and pieces. The climate of this area is sunlit and what you would call nice. It is well populated by humans and their civilization. This central zone is surrounded by several differing areas, such as Silverlight Hills, Hallowed Mountains, the Cursed Forest, and others. Each of these varies in size, climate, and terrain, with the Cursed Forest being, well, a cursed forest, and the Hallowed Mountains being, you guessed it, mountainous. Within each of the zones are various factions or races, like vampiric monsters, steampunk, inventor types, swamp creatures, and religious human fanatics. Different factions in the game will attack each other if they come into contact, and sometimes even inadvertently helping to defeat a boss. This helps the game to feel somewhat alive, as there are patrols running about the place, knocking into enemies and such. There's also weather effects like lightning storms or fog that will eventually blind your map completely. I think they've done really well with the biomes here. It doesn't feel bland as you constantly run about different zones and locations. Within these zones, the general gameplay loop for V-Rising consists of venturing forth from your castle, wherever you have located it, to seek out foes to vanquish and items and materials to collect, which you can then take back to your castle and make use of. You need to vanquish foes for several reasons. Firstly, with normal enemy NPCs, which are not bosses, they will drop items that you'll need, from crafting items to research books and other bits and pieces. They also drop a certain amount of blood, which is needed for your castle. Lastly, and most vitally, you can drain them of all their blood when they're in a weakened state. What this does is fill up your blood meter, and depending on the quality of the NPC and the blood within them, benefit from some bonuses. Because, dear viewer, you are a vampire, and vampires need blood to sustain them. As you play, between times of drinking an NPC's red stuff, your blood meter will drain away, and if it ever reaches 0, you'll begin losing health and eventually die. So obviously it is important to make sure that you have a decent amount of blood. I mentioned the quality just now, and that is quite important too. When you mouse over an NPC, it will tell you what type of blood it is, like warrior, brute, rogue, etc., along with the quality from 0 to 100. If you drain a warrior, you will receive warrior type bonuses, like raw power, or if you drain a rogue, you will receive bonuses to crits and that sort of thing. The thing to remember is that you want to aim for higher percentages if you can, so that the number of bonuses will be more. So not only do you need blood to survive, you also want to get some good quality stuff, as they say. Selecting different types can help you out for different purposes. If you want to crit a lot, then rogue is good, or if you want some non-combat focused bonuses, then draining a worker NPC would be most beneficial. So, you are running about draining blood and killing NPCs. Scattered throughout the land, all over the place, are various materials that you'll need to harvest. Trees, rocks, mineral veins, plant matter, boxes, barrels, and other bits and pieces. These are required to create all sorts of stuff, so you'll be farming them constantly. In order to actually gather these things, in the grand old style, you simply need to hit them. You'll gain resources from the node every time you strike them, eventually using it up. You can hit them with anything, but certain weapons at your disposal will be more efficient at collecting different materials. For example, an axe and later the greatsword is great for trees, but a mace is better suited to smash down rock and mineral veins. Doing this after a while can feel arduous and a bit of a slog, but there are other ways of getting materials of which I will talk of shortly. You have an inventory, like you might imagine, that will fill up pretty quickly. Of course, you'll want to head back to the base with all the things you have acquired, so you'll need to head back to your castle. There exist fast travel teleportation shrines throughout the world, which you can use to instantly move between locations, and even one in your castle. The problem is that there are a lot of items that are flagged as non-teleportable. This means that most of the time, if your bags are not empty, you will need to instead run all the way back to your base. I imagine this must be a thing with multiplayer, but for single player, it is quite a pain in the bum to slog back to the castle over a long distance. There is a setting which can be changed from the server settings when loading to turn this off. I wasn't aware you could change it until very far in, but I would 100% have this setting off from the start if I played through V-Rising again. Besides fighting normal NPCs and collecting things, you're also able to track and engage with boss mobs. These are powerful named NPCs that come with deadly attacks that you must avoid while doing them in as best you can. Some you will find walking the roads, but a lot of them tend to be static somewhere in a decently sized area for you to fight them. If you can defeat them, they will drop some bits and you'll also unlock new crafting options and skill points to invest. Right, as I mentioned skill points, I should probably talk about your character and combat. At first you'll only have a sword available at a low quality. After not too long a time, you'll have acquired numerous types of weapons, like axes, a large mace, spear, reaping blade, and a number of ranged weapons. You can have several equipped at once, and you can switch between them at will, using the action bar. They have a basic attack which you can spam, while unlocking a further 2 skills when you build up your equipment. You can obviously have a favourite one that you like to use in combat, or you can select them on their appropriateness for the current fight. There is a durability system in place, which means you periodically have to repair your gear, taking vital resources. Again, I guess this is a consideration for online play, but to me, it was a pain in the bum, which drained resources and didn't feel like it added much. I am aware you can also turn down this setting. Besides your weapon attacks, you also have access to spells from various schools, like Unholy, Blood, Fire, Frost and Shock. When downing boss mobs, you will usually gain a point for one of them, as I mentioned. You will slowly unlock different spells as you progress through the game, and the big bad enemies you bring down. There is quite a variance in spells you can obtain. Some are defensive in nature, like freezing enemies when you're struck. Some are self-buffs that increase your attack speed or cause you to leech life for a period of time. And of course, there are the straight-up offensive spells. These include projectile abilities like firing shadow bolts or what have you, along with straight-line attacks, ground slams, and self-AoE or area of effect abilities. A lot of the attacks are what you might call skill shots, which means you will need to aim them properly to try and hit as many targets as possible, or at least one on their own. Part of me thinks it would be nice to unlock the spells I like, rather than having them be a specific spell school to choose from. I guess it helps to introduce all the spell schools, as well as poking you to try out different sorts of abilities. There are a few levels of spells within each school, along with ultimate abilities that you can choose from. You can only have one ultimate ability equipped at once, for they are very powerful skills. They also have a long cooldown to go with it, so you can't just spam the most dangerous ability and wreck everything within sight. While fighting general enemies and bosses, you will need to make use of your weapon and magic spells while moving correctly to defeat them. You have an active dodge ability, which phases you out of reality for a moment, allowing you to swiftly move from danger. This dodge can be modified by different spell schools as well. Combat in V-Rising feels smooth and flows well, especially if you make good use of your spells and abilities. No fight feels too janky or unfair, and if you're up to the challenge, you can take every boss down in the end. You can only take on bosses and mobs that are close to your power level though, which is determined by your equipment. You cannot simply rush to the higher level areas and have a hope of downing more powerful bosses. Well, I can't anyway. Though there were a few occasions when a boss too high for me to combat properly was engaged with other NPCs, which allowed me to strike them down while they were otherwise preoccupied. Crafting in V-Rising, as you can imagine, is a big thing. You're able to create all number of things, from armour, weaponry and potions to items for your castle, both functional and aesthetic in nature, as well as things needed to create those things. There is a lot of different crafting stations that you can add to your castle, from forges and tanneries to alchemy labs, crafting tables, blood presses and all sorts. Luckily, you are not presented with all these options as soon as you start the game, becoming completely overwhelmed with the vast number of things you can make. Instead, you will unlock certain crafting stations as you progress through, and further options for those crafting stations too. This is the sort of progression you would want in a game like this. I've played games before where multiple systems and options are thrown at you all at once, which just made me put the game down as it was all too much to take, becoming overwhelming. I am an old dwarf and need to take things a bit slower. One thing I would say is that by the end of my time with the game, there were so many crafting stations that it was quite unwieldy at times. As you progress through the game, you'll unlock the ability to charm NPCs out in the world and bind them to your will as thralls. These thralls have their own stats, which, along with their blood quality level, will give them a certain level that can be risen further by equipping them with armour and equipment. You can then send them out into the world using a mission system, where you assign them to a location on the map and they will go off and gather whatever materials might be available there. For example, sending them off to an iron mine will reward you with iron ore and other bits, while a village might reward paper and scrolls and cloth and such. This system means you don't need to be constantly going out and farming materials, especially the more basic stuff, as I think this would become a bit of a grind, and it did to an extent. In V-Rising there are many things to craft, and you will need to be crafting a lot as you upgrade your gear and produce high level reagents that you will need for further customization. At first, I thought I had to stand at a crafting station while you created something, but this isn't the case. You can put in the mats and the crafting will go off automatically with a countdown appearing, showing how long it will take. Indeed, a lot of the crafting options, like creating wooden planks, which is used in a lot of things, you simply chuck in a load of logs you have farmed and the sawmill will get to it and create wooden boards. So the crafting is fairly straightforward, and what is needed to make certain things is usually quite clear. But what I would say is that mostly new recipes and crafting stations are unlocked by defeating certain bosses found in the world. Many key recipes are locked behind tough bosses, so you will need to give all your worth as you attempt to slay them. You will probably die several times, but you will get there in the end. Mark this old dwarf's words. Armour, weapons and decorations for your castle are researched using a research station along with some books found out in the world, but creating these crafting stations and the important reagents are only gained from defeating bosses. As you might imagine, V-Rising has a day and night cycle. During the day, when the sun rises high in the sky and breathes death into your kind, you will need to be careful where you move, hiding as you can in the shadows of trees or rocks and other such things. For if you stray too long into the embrace of the star above, you'll be smited with ever-increasing ferocity until you are naught but ashes on the ground. This means you'll need to keep to the shadows during the day, or you're going to die pretty quick. This adds a whole nother factor that you'll have to take note of when moving around and fighting with NPCs. During the day, you'll need to try and engage enemies in an area where shadows are cast long, or inside a building or cave. It does a lot for the atmosphere of the game and the roleplay that drives home the point that you are in fact a creature of the night. This is cool, but it can be a pain in the bum as sometimes you try to make your way around the place and get caught out with nowhere to move. Several times I failed in a fight because I strayed too long into the sunshine, but it's fine, this is what this game is about. Luckily, the day will eventually transform into the night. This is the best time to be out and about, as you can move anywhere you wish without worry of being turned into a crispy vampire. There is also randomly sometimes a blood moon that not only brings the night, but also empowers you further by increasing the effects of whatever blood you've recently drunk. It feels like there's been a lot of development going on here with V-Rising. There are late game currencies and challenges available with strange incursions along with powerful weapons you can reforge back to their powerful selves. There's also another way to customise your character through using Stygian at a certain crafting station unlocked later on. Here you can use Stygian you have collected and or crafted to give your character certain perks to your liking. As a single player experience, V-Rising is most definitely worthwhile, and I had a good time playing it. I didn't feel like I was playing a lesser version of the game, and none of the features felt like they held back any fun that I may have had, besides a few things like not being able to teleport between transporters if you have certain items on you. There were some crafted items I had no need of, like the various castle keys, as mine was the only castle in the land. Though there were at times some quite challenging boss encounters, I never felt like any enemies were undefeatable, and with some patience and a bit of decent gear, I could bring any of them down in the end. You will need to be on your game though, I must say, or normal and above. Of course, if you want to have a more leisurely experience, and there's nothing wrong with that dear viewers, then you can switch to the story mode difficulty. The variance in both skill and gear setups lent a lot to customising your vampire for your particular style. The different spell schools provide different flavours of combat and you can switch them out as you wish. The Stygian upgrades also add an extra layer of player progression. From my time playing single player V-Rising, I didn't reach a point where I felt like I was missing out on aspects of the game or I was unable to progress because I was on my own. Playing single player, I felt like I had a solid experience, and though it could perhaps be slower progression-wise to solo, it was still perfectly fine and I had a lot of fun. I imagine there's a whole other side to the game with multiple players, and perhaps I would find that enjoyable too, but solely through the lenses of one old dwarf, I had a lot of fun. The combat feels visceral and skill challenging. There is great variance in both weapon and skills to use that allows you to create a character you enjoy. The flow of gathering and crafting is good, but you can get a little overwhelmed sometimes with the sheer number of crafting stations towards the end of the game. I would love to have been able to craft with items directly from my storage boxes, rather than having to have items in my inventory, but perhaps there is good reason multiplayer wise why this isn't allowed. There are periods in the game where you'll be grinding away, farming materials and reagents for things, so that is something to be aware of. This isn't like an old-fashioned ARPG, you'll be crafting all the gear and weapons that you can use, and this can take a little while to get, so bear that in mind. All in all, I would suggest that V-Rising is a very good game, and is great fun as a single-player endeavour. If you were wondering if it was viable and fun solo, then I would resoundingly say, yes sir, most definitely. I would though suggest turning off the limitations to fast travel from the start, so you don't spend so much time slogging back and forth. The main game is £30 currently on Steam, which I do think is worth it. If you like ARPGs, vampires and building up your base, then you will really enjoy this game. And there we go dear viewers. Another video from me here down in the ancient hold. Does this look like a game you might enjoy? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I shall see you next time.